When we think about Indian independence, I think most of us have a set of images or a sequence of thoughts that go through our mind. Scenes of the British humiliating Indians, Bhagat Singh chucking bombs, Gandhi marching with a huge crowd behind him, the massacre of Jallianwala Bagh. I feel like in school we learn our side of the story, but there's a whole other side we don't even get into. In fact, there's many sides to this story just as there are to all stories in history. In this series, I want to show you some of these sides that we are not familiar with so that we can better understand why things happen rather than just what happened because it's very boring. Along the way, I'll zoom in to give you a look at the lives of the people who lived in this period so that we can get the panoramas and the close-up shots. Let's start with the British because we don't know much about them other than that they were white, greedy, cunning and had a queen. We'll talk about why and how they ended up trading in Asia in the first place. So any overseas empire has to start somewhere, right? Someone has to find a place to claim, then they have to plant a flag there, then they have to go and shoot some natives. So where did the British Empire start? The Caribbean? North America? It should be one of these places, right? But actually the answer might lie in a place that you've probably never heard of. The empire on which the sun never set had begun on Pulau Rune in the Banda Islands, at the eastern end of the Indonesian archipelago. To show it to someone on a normal book-sized map would be impossible because it's too tiny to show up. The island is actually 2 miles by half a mile. If you were there, it would have taken a day to walk all over it. You would have seen a few natives, some small shelters for them, not much else. If there was a botanist around, they would have noticed large numbers of a certain kind of tree, which was medium-sized, had darkish leaves, and it would have had fruit that looked like an alien egg. They'd say it was called the Myristica fragrans. This tree is better known as the nutmeg tree. According to author John Key, actually a lot of this episode is according to John Key. Anyway, he says, for the nutmegs and for the mace, those first visitors in 1603 would willingly have sailed around the world several times. Nowhere else on the globe did the trees flourish, and so nowhere else was their fruit so cheap. In the minuscule Banda Islands of Rune, Ai, Lonthor and Nera, 10 pounds of nutmeg cost less than half a penny and 10 pounds of mace less than 5 pence. Yet, in Europe, the same quantities could be sold for £1.60 and 16 pounds respectively, a tidy appreciation of approximately 32,000%. By 1616, feeling threatened into submission by the Dutch, who were already involved in the spice trade before the British, the head tribesmen of Rune voted to pledge their allegiance to England, who promised them support, making King James the King of England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Pulau and Pulau Rune. And so, Rune became the first overseas colony of the British Empire. So Rune and Ai went directly under the control of the king. Because in the still early days of the East India Company, it was not authorized to hold territory of its own. The British government and the company had a hard time controlling Rune due to the Dutch who were aggressively trying to claim it as their own. When it was time to give up the island to the Dutch, the British would sign the Treaty of Breda, in which they would exchange the island of Rune for another tiny island in North America called New Amsterdam. You might have heard of this place. But around 50 years later, it was keeping Rune in mind that the East India Company would be allowed to hold overseas territory, thanks to King Charles II. Okay, let's hold that thought for a bit and talk about the reason they went to Asia in the first place: spices. I'm sure you've heard of Europeans coming to Asia to trade for spices. But why did they want the spices so much? Well, because profit. In the process of trade, their value appreciated phenomenally. What were basic culinary ingredients in South Asia had become exotic luxuries by the time they reached the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Pepper made meat smell better and gave it flavor. Cloves were used in cooking and medicine. Nutmeg was used as a preservative, and some people wore it around their neck, believing it would protect them from the plague. Which makes no sense. White pot pudding is one recipe I found made using spices including mace and nutmeg. Another is Yorkshire Parkin. The recipes, which are from historical food websites, are in the description below. Like tea, coffee, and even tobacco, it was as expensive health foods that the spices gradually entered everyday diet. And on top of this, spices made for great cargo because they were lightweight and didn't spoil quickly if they were dry. So it was for the extremely profitable spices that the English came looking for all those years ago. But how did they know about the only source of nutmeg on some tiny islands on the other side of the world? And why did they only reach in 1603 and not earlier or later for that matter? And how did the Dutch get to the Spice Islands 2 years before them anyway? And of course, how did all this result in them colonizing India? These are some of the questions I will address in the next episode. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.